It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, just me and my friends, enjoying the beach and getting away from everything. The house was simple but charming, the perfect place to unwind. We were getting ready for dinner on the patio when one of us, Lucas, screamed from outside. I ran to him and saw wet footprints on the ground, a clear trail of damp sand that led straight from the ocean to the patio door. No one had gone swimming. I was confused, and everyone started wondering what could have caused it. We thought it might be a prank or an animal, but it was so strange. And to make things worse, the tide was low. There were no footprints leading back to the sea. We felt uneasy and decided to lock all the doors and windows, even though we thought it might just be our imagination. The night passed without further incidents, but when we woke up the next morning, something was wrong. Sand was scattered across the living room floor as if someone had come in again and walked around. And the walls, they didn't just have sand marks, but strange lines, as though something had scratched the surface, deep, yet almost symmetrical. I tried to make sense of it, but nothing added up. We all started searching the house, trying to figure out what had happened. But the more we looked, the clearer it became that something, or someone, was there with us. We decided to split up and search the house in groups, looking for any sign that someone had broken in. We checked the back, thinking maybe someone was hiding there, but there was nothing. No open windows, nothing broken, nothing to explain what we'd seen. When I returned to the living room, I noticed that the marks on the walls weren't as symmetrical anymore. They seemed to have spread, as if something had moved through the house while we were away. The worst part was that the marks seemed to concentrate at one specific spot near the front door, as though something had tried to get in but couldn't. And then there was the smell, a salty odor reminiscent of the ocean but strange, like a mix of rot and seaweed. We decided to step outside for a bit and try to make sense of what was happening, but as we stepped onto the patio, something stopped me. The trail of footprints was there again, but this time the footprints didn't stop at the patio door. They continued. They led to the middle of the garden and vanished into the sand as if something had been dragged into the house. The sea was calm, but a chill ran through me. Something was watching us, that was clear. We couldn't ignore the signs anymore. It felt like we were trapped in something we didn't understand, but it was already closing in on us. We all stood in silence, the idea that we were no longer alone settling in with an unsettling finality. We tried to stay calm, but things kept getting stranger. When we went back inside, the atmosphere was colder than ever. The doors and windows were still locked, but the feeling that we weren't alone was overwhelming. The silence in the house was unnerving. I tried calling the police, but my phone had no signal. Looking out the window, something made me freeze. There, at the edge of the patio, was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew someone or something was there watching me. The tension was unbearable, and the feeling of being hunted consumed us. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do, but we all knew one thing. The presence in that house was real, and it had no intention of letting us leave. Desperate and unsure, we decided to leave. But when we got to the car, the road was eerily empty, as if the way back to town had disappeared. The sky was dark and overcast, and it felt like something was pressing down on the atmosphere. Returning to the house, things got even stranger. The sand in the living room was now in large mounds, arranged in a formation that seemed deliberate. Like something had made a path through the house, creating a trail. That's when we remembered something important. No one else had entered, but with each passing moment, it became clearer that someone or something had been invited inside, and we wouldn't be able to get rid of it. We stood frozen, unsure of where to go. It felt like we were caught in a trap, and every move only drew us deeper into the realization that we couldn't escape. The living room light began flickering, and the sound of water crashing against the ocean walls grew fainter, as though the sea itself was pulling back, but in a wrong way, like an invisible force drawing everything inward. The sand piled up even more, now forming strange shapes, lines, and circles that made no sense. The smell of salt and rotting fish grew stronger, and the humidity in the house was unbearable. I looked at my friends, and they were just as terrified as I was. No one knew what to do, and the worst part was that, with each passing second, it became clear that this place was becoming more dangerous for us. Then the patio door creaked open on its own. The sound of wood groaning sent shivers down my spine. There was no wind, no logical explanation. The door opened slowly, as if inviting something or someone inside. Reluctantly, but feeling like there was no other choice, we decided to investigate. What we found outside, however, froze us in terror. In the middle of the patio were wet footprints, but this time, they didn't come from the sea. They came from inside the house as if something had emerged and dragged itself toward the ocean. The footprint stopped before reaching the shore, but now the sea looked more turbulent. The sound of waves crashing was replaced by something far more unsettling, a low, muffled laugh that seemed to come from within the water but surrounded us completely. Hist 5. I've never been one to believe in those stories that circulate on the internet, but after what happened to me that night, I simply can't ignore them anymore. I've been working as an Uber driver for almost 3 years, and I've experienced all kinds of strange situations, but nothing comes close to what I went through that early morning. It was a Tuesday, and business was slow. After midnight, only the most desperate drivers stay out, and I was one of them, trying to meet my weekly goal. When I got a ride request, the pickup address was in a remote part of the city, almost deserted. I thought about ignoring it, but since surge pricing was in effect, I decided to accept. When I arrived, the place looked like something out of a horror movie. There was no lighting, just a broken street lamp casting eerie shadows on the asphalt. I waited in the car for a few minutes, checking the app to make sure I was in the right spot. Just as I was about to cancel, someone appeared out of nowhere. It was a tall, skinny man wearing a long coat that seemed far too heavy for the season. He got into the car without saying a word, confirmed the destination with a nod, and said in a low, dragging voice something like, "Just go straight." At the time, I found it strange but not unusual. Many passengers prefer silence. As I drove, something about him unsettled me. It wasn't just the silence, but the way he kept staring at me through the rearview mirror. Usually people look out the window, fiddle with their phones, or even fall asleep, but he never took his eyes off me. It was a fixed, almost hypnotic stare, as if he were studying my every move. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Finally, I decided to break the silence, asking if he was sure about the destination. He only responded with a murmur, something like, "You're going the right way." His voice was so low I could barely hear it, but it still sent a strange chill through me. The route he directed me to led to a part of the city I wasn't familiar with. The streets were deserted, the buildings old and falling apart. The GPS didn't recognize the address, and when I asked again if this was really where he wanted to go, he just pointed ahead, saying nothing. That's when I began to feel that something was truly wrong. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and for a second, it looked like he wasn't there anymore. My heart raced, but when I looked again, he was in the exact same position, staring at me as if he had never looked away. The discomfort was becoming unbearable. My whole body felt tense as I navigated the narrow, poorly lit streets. The silence inside the car felt heavy, as if the air itself were charged with something I couldn't explain. Finally, he asked me to stop in front of an abandoned building with broken windows and walls covered in graffiti. The place looked like it had been deserted for decades. I parked the car and waited for him to get out, but he didn't move. "Is this it?" I asked, trying not to show my nervousness. He didn't respond, just slowly turned his head toward the window, as if observing something only he could see. After a few seconds, I turned around to insist, but the back seat was empty. I never heard the sound of the door opening, and I am absolutely certain I didn't see him leave. My heart pounded as I looked around, thinking he might have gotten out so quickly I hadn't noticed, but it didn't make sense. The car was locked, and he would have had to pass by me to open the door. I stayed there for a while, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing added up. I decided to leave as quickly as possible, feeling as if the place was swallowing me whole. I drove home with trembling hands on the wheel. The ride seemed endless, and the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I had the impression that something was there, but there was never anything. When I finally got home, I could barely sleep. I kept replaying the situation in my head, trying to find a logical explanation, but none seemed to fit. I even thought I might have been imagining things, maybe from exhaustion, but deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. The next day, still haunted by what happened, I decided to do a quick Google search about the address where I dropped him off. That's when I found something that froze me in place. Among several articles about the building's abandonment, there was one about a man who had disappeared years ago in that very area. When I clicked on it, a chill ran down my spine. The physical description matched my passenger exactly. Tall, thin, always wearing a long coat. The article even had an old photo, and it was him. There was no doubt. The man who got into my car that night had been missing for at least a decade. I stared at the photo on the website, trying to make sense of it. It was him, the same face, the same empty eyes. voice. I started doubting myself, thinking maybe I had seen wrong or was confusing things, but what happened next erased any doubts I had left. When I went to get my car that afternoon to start another shift, I found something that chilled me to the bone. On the back seat, right where he had been sitting, there were clear marks of dirt, but not in a normal way. They were dark, slightly damp stains with a strange smell I couldn't identify. I tried cleaning the stains, but they wouldn't come off. And then when I started the car, the radio, which had been off, began emitting static. A low, distorted voice emerged through the crackling noise, saying something I couldn't quite make out, but it sounded like a name. His name. I turned the radio off immediately, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. It felt as if someone was there with me in the back seat, staring at me. When I rented the countryside house, all I wanted was some peace. My marriage was in shambles, and all I needed was silence, a place to think and find myself again. The house was charming, with its rustic appearance and surrounded by open fields. It seemed like the perfect refuge. On the first night, I slept better than I had in ages, but as the week went on, things began to change. At first, it was a strange sensation of not being alone. Then the whispers started. Always late at night, when everything was quiet, I'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling like someone had called my name, but the house was empty. One day, while exploring the dusty basement, I found a diary. The cover was worn, and the pages smelled of mold, but they were still legible. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who seemed to be the last person to live there. The first entries were normal. She wrote about the garden, the book she was reading, mundane things. But as I kept reading, the tone shifted. Eleanor started mentioning noises at night, objects disappearing and reappearing in different places, and in the final entry she wrote something that sent chills down my spine. The house wants me to stay, but I have to leave before it's too late. After reading that last sentence, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The desperate tone of Eleanor's words made me glance around the basement as if something were watching me. I hurried up the stairs, taking the diary with me. I tried to convince myself that it was all just in my head, symptoms of isolation and loneliness. But that night, the whispers returned. This time they seemed closer, as if coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart raced, but I didn't have the courage to get out of bed and check. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the diary in my hands. The next day, despite my fear, I decided to keep reading. The most recent entries described visions Eleanor had experienced, images of a dark figure that always appeared in her peripheral vision, but vanished when she tried to look directly at it. She also mentioned memory lapses, as if she was losing hours of her day without explanation. I was beginning to understand what she meant. For days, I felt like time was slipping away, as if I blinked and hours had vanished. That same day, when I looked into the bathroom mirror for a second, I didn't recognize my own reflection. That night, things got worse. I woke up feeling suffocated, as if someone was sitting on my chest, and when I opened my eyes, I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room near the door. I jumped out of bed and turned on the light, but there was nothing there. I tried to take deep breaths and calm myself, but I noticed something even stranger. My hands were covered in dirt, as if I'd been digging. I ran to the bathroom to wash them, but as the water flowed, flashes started flooding my mind. I was outside the house, holding a shovel, burying something in the garden, yet I had no memory of going out that night. The following day, I was consumed by a constant sense of paranoia. What was happening to me? I went to the garden, trying to find any evidence of what I might have done. There were marks on the ground, disturbed soil, but nothing to explain the flashes I'd seen. Later, as I reread Eleanor's diary, I found something that left me panicked. She had also mentioned waking up with dirt-covered hands, and the last time it happened, she wrote, "It's not just the house watching me, it's something more, something that's using me." As the days passed, I started losing my sense of time. The visions grew more intense and frequent. I saw Eleanor, or at least something that looked like her, in every corner of the house. Her pale face with empty eyes would appear for a second in mirrors or window reflections. I tried to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The feeling of being controlled intensified, as if my own thoughts were no longer mine. I began doing things without understanding why, like when I went down to the basement and found more disturbed soil, more signs that something had been buried, but I had no memory of going there. Each night, the whispers became clearer. They no longer just called my name. Now they told me what to do. Go to the garden. Dig deeper. I couldn't ignore them anymore. Deep down, I knew all of this was connected to Eleanor. The house somehow was feeding on us. I was losing control of my mind, and I knew that if I didn't do something, I might end up like her, disappearing without a trace. One night, too exhausted to resist, I did what the whispers commanded. With trembling hands, I grabbed the shovel and went to the garden. The air was heavy, and the silence was deafening, but somehow I felt like I was being guided, that this was the only thing I was meant to do. I dug and dug until the shovel hit something hard. My heart raced as I cleared away the soil, revealing an old wooden box covered in moss and rust. When I opened it, I found a broken porcelain doll with wide, staring eyes and a frozen smile. But the worst part was the piece of fabric inside the box, a fragment of the same dress Eleanor wore in the photos from her diary. I froze for a few moments, staring at the doll, feeling the weight of everything crash down on me. Then I heard a voice in my ear, soft and icy. "Now it's your turn." I looked around, but there was no one there. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Panic took over me. I knew I was trapped somewhere between reality and a nightmare. Something in the house, something ancient and malevolent, was consuming me. I was either losing my mind or being possessed by the same force that had driven Eleanor to madness. I tried to run, but as I turned to leave the garden, the ground seemed to close around me. The path blurred, distorted, as if the house had stretched its reach to trap me there. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. When I touched the doorknob, a freezing sensation spread through my hands as though I were touching solid ice. Panic overwhelmed me, but I couldn't scream. The entire house seemed to breathe with me, as if it were alive, watching my every move. Finally, in a desperate impulse, I slammed the door and suddenly it opened. I gasped for air, not understanding how I'd managed, and ran back inside. But as I entered, I noticed something horrifying. The furniture was displaced, as if the house had rearranged everything incorrectly. The living room mirror reflected something that wasn't me, but Eleanor. Her pale, lifeless face stared back at me. I was losing the fight, the house was consuming me, and I had no idea how to escape. The feeling of being swallowed by the house grew stronger, and I was starting to lose track of where reality ended and the nightmare began. Eleanor's figure in the mirror seemed to distort as my body started to change, or at least that's what I thought. My hands were cold and pale, as if I were no longer myself. I could feel her presence inside me, her memories overtaking mine. The worst part was realizing that everything I was doing now mirrored what she had done before. Every movement, every step I took had already been hers, and worst of all, everything was repeating itself. The house was absorbing me, and I began to see flashes of Eleanor's life, her disappearance, and her desperate fight to escape the same trap. Then, in the middle of one of these visions, something changed. I saw Eleanor's diary, but it wasn't the same one I had found. It was in my hands, and the words were being written as I watched. "You are on her path. You are already her. Now, it's your turn." I couldn't bear it any longer. I tried to scream. I tried to run, but there was no escape. I was inside the house and inside Eleanor. I had become part of her. It was as if the house was hungry and had finally devoured me completely.